Hello and welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I delve into the life, conquests, character, and legacy of the scourge of the world, the Prince of Darkness, the Great Lion, the Man of Iron, he who was lame, Emir Timur. Last episode, we began Season 3 by witnessing Emir Timur seemingly making a change in his rule. Because so far, from his Kurultai and ascent to the throne of Mawarnar in 1370 until 1380, Timur's rule has been largely centered with the lands of the former Chagatai Khanate. He had invaded the eastern portion of the Chagatai Khanate, Moghulistan, several times, and although he had never managed to capture or kill the Mughal ruler Khan Kamaruddin, these invasions had done much to gain an ample amount of treasures and slaves, give his men experience, and most importantly, prove Timur's authority and leadership. This decade also saw Timur's 3 wars with the Sufi dynasty of Khwarezmia, which finally ended with the sacking of the city of Urgench and the acquisition of this territory into Timur's realm. And finally, Timur spent this decade consolidating his rule, rooting out and smashing any rebellious attempts in the tribes, securing his family's roles, building up his capital of Samarkand, and preparing for his step into the larger world. This culminated with Timur welcoming, adopting, and supporting a young man who had made a claim to Timur's northern neighbors, the Golden Horde, which was another remnant of the Mongol Empire. And if you'll remember, this young man was named Toktamish, and we will return to his story shortly. Not in today's episode, but probably in the next few. Anyway, last episode, we saw how Timur's experience now shifted outside of the lands of Mawarnar and into Persia. The lands of Persia had not been former Chagatai Khanate territory, but instead had been ruled by the Ilkhanate. And it was the Ilkhanate's collapse in 1335 that splintered this area into many factions and rival rulers that all started fighting each other in different ways at different times. And to make that political hodgepodge a bit more organized, we introduced to ourselves to what I'm calling the BIG Persian Five. That is, the 5 most prominent Persian powers in the year 1380. And these are as follows. Number 1. The Jalayirids, centered around Baghdad, or their capital being Baghdad, but with territories in what we would today call Eastern Iraq, Kuwait, Azerbaijan, and Western Iran. So far, Timur has not had too much exposure with the Jalayirids, as they are the furthest from him, but that will change a bit later. Anyway, the second of the Big Persian Five, the Musafirids, who today would be in southern Iran. Again, Timur has yet to come into contact with them, but this will change in today's episode, so keep them in mind. Thirdly, last episode we talked about Timur's first invasion of Persia, namely his invasion of the Kart dynasty in Khorasan with their capital of Herat. Although there was some initial defense, Timur took Herat and allowed the city and its inhabitants to be spared. The ruler of the Kart dynasty, Sultan Malik, was also spared, albeit with the catch that he and his family were made permanent residents of Samarkand. And as we'll see with the rest of this podcast, whenever Timur makes you a permanent resident of Samarkand, it rarely ends well for you. Nevertheless, they were alive for now and treated very well by Timur, who added the former lands of the Kart dynasty and the mighty city of Herat to his growing empire. The overseeing of these new territories was given to Timur's third son, the Prince Miran Shah. We then talked about the fourth of the Big Persian Five, the Sarbadars, a collection of various Shia, Muslim, and military rulers in central Persia. After defeating the Kart dynasty of Khorasan, Timur marched into Sarbadar territory, where the Sarbadars very quickly pledged their allegiance to Timur. This arrangement was accepted, and the Sarbadar leader Ali Muayyad was greatly rewarded by Timur. But this led Timur into conflict with the fifth of the Big Persian Five, the land of Mazandaran, led by Amir Wali. and he sat with a nice little kingdom on the southern banks of the Caspian Sea. But after Timur annihilated the town of Esfarayan, which was allied or servant to Amir Wali, Wali very quickly himself pledged service to Timur. But he postponed actually traveling to Timur to submit in person. Anyway, finally, although not quite powerful enough to be added to the Big Persian Five, there was a man we met last episode, a local warlord named Ali Beg, who was ruler of the forts of Kalat and Tus in northern Persia. But he also submitted to Timur when Timur passed through. Thus, we finished last episode with the end of Timur's first invasion of Persia. It had been a smashing success. 3 of the Big Persian Five had been conquered or subdued, so Timur decided to return to Samarkand. So now, let's return to the narrative at hand. It is the autumn of 1381, and Timur enters his beloved city of Samarkand. But with the celebration of Timur's victory comes an unexpected sorrow. A few episodes ago, we saw how devastated Timur became when his son, the Prince Jahangir, died unexpectedly from sickness. When this had happened, we saw how the Emir went into what sounded like an extreme state of prolonged depression. He didn't eat, he didn't attend to his duties of his realm, and he no longer found joy in activities that he once did. It took months, and only because his friends and family were regularly begging for him to bring him back into life. And now, here in 1381, disaster hits Timur's family again. We have talked about Timur's 4 sons, but Timur also had 5 daughters. It's possible that he had far more sons and daughters, but these were the accepted children from Timur's established wives. Anyway, of these 5 daughters, one was named Aki Beg. She was born to the same woman that Jahangir had been born to, Timur's wife Turmish Aga. And as Turmish Aga was one of Timur's favorite wives, and Jahangir had been Timur's favorite son until his death, Aki Beg was one of Timur's favorite daughters, possibly even his favorite one. And we don't know that for sure, but maybe that's the case. Anyway, Aki Beg had been married to a son of Amir Musa, and if you'll remember way back in the show, Amir Musa had been one of Timur's closest friends, mentors, allies, and then even eventual enemies, but Timur's respect for the man had never waned, and this marriage had united the 2 families. So obviously she was an important woman both within the kingdom and in Timur's life, but unfortunately we don't know too much about her other than that. However, we do have a nice quote from Yazdi, and this is how he describes her. She had scarce her equal in beauty and virtue, her mind was adorned with the brightest graces, and her behavior attracted the love of all. In short, she was endowed with such loving qualities that the emperor, her father, loved her tenderly. But 5 years after having lost his son Jahangir to sickness, Timur lost his daughter Aki Beg to sickness as well. And as Yazdi says rather poetically, all are obliged to submit to the decrees of fate. I do not have children yet, so it's hard for me to grasp the full devastation that losing a child brings. However, 2 of my best friends lost their baby just a few months ago, and to say that they were emotionally devastated would be an understatement. It's something no parent should ever have to endure. As for Timur, he was no different. The news of his daughter's passing utterly shocked and gutted him. Here was a man who had tens of thousands of men at his command. He was quickly becoming one of the richest leaders in Asia. His city had been built into a glorious monument to his reign. He had entire legions of intellectuals, doctors, religious leaders, philosophers, all at his call. And yet, for all this strength, for all this power, he could do nothing to stop sickness and death. The Zafarnama says this: The Emperor Timur, who boasted that he was able to withstand the shock of misfortunes, was so afflicted by her death that he forbade everyone his presence. Timur fell into depression and apathy again, and nobody could do anything to pull him out of it. The direness of the situation made itself apparent when messengers arrived from Ali Muayyad, leader of the Sarbadars. Ali Muayyad had remained loyal to Timur, but the other powers in Persia had not. Amir Wali, ruler of Mazandaran on the Caspian Sea, had revolted against Timur. It seemed that his postponing of appearing before Timur in person and submitting had never actually been a plan. He had simply said he would come as an excuse, but this man had no intentions of ever submitting for long. As soon as Timur was gone from Persia, Wali was acting on his own accord. Not only that, he formed a military alliance with Ali Beg, the ruler of the fortresses of Kalat and Tus, who we talked about a little bit. And then the two men marched their combined forces into Sarbadar territory, laying siege to the Sarbadar capital of Sabzavar. Ali Muayyad sent word to Timur begging for protection as they were still loyal to him, but the situation for the Sarbadars looked grim. And this was not the only location of Timur's realm that wasn't doing so hot. To the east, Timur's old enemy, the Moghuls, led by Khan Kamaruddin, they were stirring. Although not full-on invading, the Moghuls were crossing into Timurid territory, raiding farmlands and villages in the Fergana Valley for slaves and loot. And finally, down in Khorasan, the city of Herat, which had been spared by Timur, now rose in open rebellion. The rebellion was not started by the people of the city, though. Instead, roaming bands of Afghan marauders took control of the city by force, or maybe they were welcomed in by various aristocratic leaders of the city. Either way, the Afghans killed or ousted the Timurid garrison and proclaimed Herat to be free. Many of the population joined, and efforts to rebuild the city's fortifications were begun. Timur had won this empire, but could he keep it? Well, with the ways things were looking, the answer was no. News arrived every day of the problems and disasters befalling Timur's subjects. His lands won in Persia had all rebelled against him or were besieged by the rebels, and even in Mawarnar, Mughal raiders were carrying off people as slaves every day. Still, Timur refused to give commands. He refused to direct orders. He refused to rule. And you have to wonder what his people were thinking. Was this the end of his reign? Had Timur given the people of Mawarnar a brief 11-year era of prosperity only to abandon them now? For his soldiers and the tribal leaders, you can bet that they were now looking at each other nervously, wondering if they would soon be enemies in the inevitable civil war that would follow if this was the end to the Timur they had known. And for Timur's family, his 3 remaining sons, how would they continue if their father's leadership was gone? The fate of Timur's young empire hung on a string. Its greatest enemy was Timur's own despair. But there were other people in Timur's story. And although they aren't given nearly the amount of attention as men, the women in Timur's life played very important roles. We just saw how much power his daughter had to bring such a great conqueror to his knees because he had loved her so much. But another influential woman was Timur's sister, a woman named Turkan Aga. Turkan Aga was a close friend and advisor to her brother Timur, and when Timur was gone on campaign, much of the rule of Samarkand was handled by her. She was renowned for her piety and charity and was greatly loved by the people. She personally even directed construction of various hospitals, mosques, and other construction endeavors. Much of the glory of the city was due to her direction. It had also been the sister who housed and cared for Timur decades earlier when he was fleeing the Moghuls. Her love for him was quite strong. And seeing his despair after the death of her niece, seeing her brother's realm falling into bits, watching the likely disappearance of their family's importance right before her eyes, Turkan Aga acted. She went to her brother and demanded that he listen to her, and he obliged. Maybe he didn't have a choice. I mean, I have 2 sisters, and I know how persuasive they can be even when I don't want to listen. But regardless, this is what she said to him. March towards Mazandaran and Kalat and chastise those proud rebels who have had the insolence to depart from their obedience. Treat them in such a manner that it may serve as an example to others. Spare not their lives, pillage their houses, let them receive a punishment adequate to their crimes. Now, I personally have had to deal with depression in my past. I regularly see a therapist for my mental health, and something she has never recommended for my depression is to pillage half of Persia. But for Timur, this is exactly the final push that he needed. Use your anger and your sadness and force that into action. Force it onto your enemies. The emir stood up. He called an officer over. Bring me my son. Bring me messengers and gather the army. It is the winter of 1381 and 1382, and Timur's second invasion of Persia begins. Every commander in military history often adopts certain traits, certain patterns of leadership. As we have seen and will continue to see with Timur, one of these traits is that he likes to move fast, he likes to move hard, and sometimes in multiple directions. And we see this here in 1382. Timur's main force, led by himself, traveled to Bukhara, where they waited for some other tribal contingents to meet up with them. They then built a bridge of boats across the Amu Darya River and crossed into Persia. They were headed directly to the rebel Ali Beg's fortress of Kalat. Then, upon dealing with him, the plan was to continue west into Mazandaran to deal with Amir Wali. Meanwhile, either at the same time or shortly hereafter, Timur's son, the young Prince Miran Shah, who had been given reign over Khorasan, he was to march to Herat to deal with the rebels holding the city. Miran Shah had sent several smaller scouting forces ahead, but was following behind with a larger attachment. And in case you want to feel worse about your achievements of your teenage years, like I do, Miran Shah was 16 years old. Anyway, as a quick side note, as for Timur's oldest surviving son, the Prince Umar Shaikh Mirza, who would have been around 25 years old at this point, we're not entirely sure where he was during this invasion, but 2 options seem likely. He was probably A, either with Timur and commanding a wing of the army. Umar Shaikh was one of Timur's most trusted and skillful commanders, as we will see a lot later, so that would not be too surprising. However, as Timur's son Miran Shah had been given rule over Khorasan, Umar Shaikh was ruler of the Fergana Valley and Timur's eastern-controlled provinces. And as these lands were being raided by the Moghuls, it's also possible that Umar Shaikh was there during the invasion, organizing a defense. But anyway, Timur's second invasion of Persia begins. And almost immediately the weight of his presence is felt. Amir Wali and Ali Beg immediately abandon their siege of Sebzevar and rush back to their territories to prepare for their own defense. In the winter months of 1381 and 1382, Timur reached the fortress of Kalat. Ali Beg, who was not a member of the BIG Persian Five, but still a powerful local warlord, had taken refuge here in this fortress, and he was more than happy to defend it. So let's very quickly take a look at this fortress of Kalat. Because not only was it a fortress, it was a fortress built on top of a mountain. And not only was it a fortress built on top of a mountain, it was a fortress built on top of a mountain with very narrow pathways that led up to it. And not only was it... Okay, I'll stop there. But seriously, this fortress was pretty imposing. It was a fortified plateau well built, well stocked, well defended, and really hard to even walk to, as there were steep cliffs on all sides, with only a few narrow walkways leading to the top. It was fortified in the ancient Persian days and was even laid siege to by Alexander the Great's men. I was unable to find a description of it from the time period we're at, but here's what William Gill, a British soldier and explorer, here's how he described Kalat in the 1870s. Now, he uses the word valley to describe the top of the plateau, that is Kalat, so don't be too confused, but this is how he described it. Kalat is one of the most remarkable places in the world. It is a natural fortress, and if anything in the world can be impregnable, it is certainly Kalat. It is a large valley surrounded on all sides by mountains, absolutely inaccessible from the outside. At the tops of these mountains can be seen perpendicular cliffs, some 200 or 300 feet high. There are 5 entrances to the valley through narrow gorges only 2 or 3 yards wide. The cliffs on each side towering up like walls. The valley, besides a stream that runs through it, is plentifully supplied from water from the springs. The inhabitants have their herds and cultivate their corn all in the valley and subsequently could not be starved out. So yeah, that sounds like a fort I would not want to lay siege to. Today, Kalat is a tourist attraction and famous for 2 reasons that stand out, aside from the fact that it's a giant fort on a plateau. The first of those reasons is that Kalat is the first district that was ruled by Nader Shah, the famous ruler of Persia in the mid-18th century. But it is also famous as being the only fortress that outlasted a siege by none other than Timur. And I like that claim. It has some power to it. It is often said that Timur never lost a battle, so saying that a fortress outlasted a siege by him is quite an impressive claim. But maybe it's not entirely accurate, maybe a little accurate. So here's what happened. Timur's forces arrived to the base of this plateau of Kalat. They surround it and begin the siege. But remember, it's nearly impossible to assault due to its sheer cliffs of 200 to 300 feet and the narrow pathways only being wide enough for a handful of men at a time. Plus, Ali Beg has plenty of soldiers, natural springs mean he won't run out of water, and there's plenty of room for the livestock to live in the fortress for quite a while. Assault is not going to happen, a siege could last forever, so what does Timur do? Well, he leaves. Yeah, Timur tells his officers and commanders that they're going to just leave Ali Beg in his fortress and go onward to Mazandaran to deal with Amir Wali. Word is spread and the army begins marching west. The siege is completely abandoned. Hearing that Timur has left, Ali Beg waited a few days just to be sure. But once there were no signs of Timur, Ali Beg gave word that all of the livestock, the herds of sheep and horses, should be brought down from Kalat and allowed to graze in the surrounding plains to fatten up again. So the livestock and the farmers and the shepherds and the herds, they empty out of the fortress. And this is when Timur returns. His retreat had been fake. He had marched his army for a few days to make everybody, including his own soldiers, believe Timur would leave Kalat alone. But it was a trap. And now, Kalat's surrounding fields and pastures were full of peasants and farmers and the hundreds of animals left to graze unprotected. Kalat's entire food source was now just out there in the open, and Timur had returned. His horsemen descended into the valleys like waves and captured or killed every living creature, both man and beast, preventing them from retreating back into Kalat. Now, Ali Beg and the majority of his soldiers had never left the mountain fortress. They were fine for the moment. But you can imagine the shock and terror, the impending doom, as they stood up there looking below at the hordes of Timurid horsemen, collecting and taking all of their livestock, all of their food. Author Hilda Hookham, paraphrasing Arab Shah, has a wonderfully haunting sentence about this. She says, Thus, deprived of all livestock and sustenance, the town was reduced to a sepulchre. Now the real siege could begin. The plateau was surrounded and the camps were pitched. Knowing that he would run out of food soon and that there was no way he could defend against such an army, Ali Beg came up with a plan. If he could cut the head off the beast, perhaps the vast Timurid host would scatter or fight amongst itself. So Ali Beg sent word to Timur, apologizing for his rebellion and asking to meet with the emir in person. Timur accepted this message and agreed to a private meeting. So Ali Beg asked Timur if the two of them could meet on the path leading up to the fortress with only a few personal bodyguards in order to discuss the terms of surrender. Timur agreed to this too, and against all of the warnings and concerns from his advisors and generals, Timur marched up the narrow mountains with only 5 bodyguards. Meanwhile, Ali Beg had stationed some of his finest soldiers to ambush Timur once he was far enough up the mountain and to kill him. And I really wish we had the actual details as to how the events played out specifically. I wish I knew what Timur was thinking. I suspect that he suspected this was a trap, but then what was actually going through his head? What was his plan? Likewise, what was going through the heads of the ambushing soldiers? Because all we're told is that when Timur arrived to the place where he was supposed to be killed, I'm getting a text from someone, when he arrived to the place where he was supposed to be killed, Ali Beg's men didn't move. They were utterly terrified. They refused to strike against Timur. So Timur realized or saw that it was a trap, and he returned back to his camp, much to the thankfulness of his army, and then the siege continued. Timur's soldiers were furious and enraged that Ali Beg had refused to meet with Timur, even though it had been him who had asked to do so, and not only did he not show up, but he was planning to kill Timur. So they asked Timur for permission to assault Kalat, and Timur agreed. He handpicked the finest warriors from his domains in Badakhshan and Afghanistan, and those were mountainous regions, and these were not soldiers who were steppe nomads. These were mountaineers. They had grown up and lived on mountains. They were ambushers. They were exactly the soldiers that Timur needed to conquer a mountain. For the next few days, Timur's Afghan men continually scaled parts of Kalat and fought the defenders. We're told that there were men fighting in the ravines and on the cliffs. Parts of the plateau would be taken by Timur's men, only then to be retaken by the defenders. Men fell to their deaths on both sides, and both sides fought like dragons. Knowing that his time was shortening, Ali Beg sent another message to Timur, asking to meet in person. But this time, Ali Beg agreed to march down to Timur's camp. Timur agreed to this, and a ceasefire was enacted. However, for one reason or another, Ali Beg never came. And Timur just decided he did not have time for this. Since it was only a matter of time until Kalat would starve out now, Timur left a force here to begin the actual siege, but then he marched on with the majority of the army. Amir Wali had to be dealt with next. On their way to Mazandaran, Timur's army came to the fortress of Turchis. Turchis had a year earlier submitted to Timur without a fight, but now they too had risen in rebellion and allied themselves to Amir Wali. So Timur surrounded the fort and assaulted it. We're given a small glance into the engineer corps that Timur had with his army at this point. Engineers and sappers dug tunnels underneath the walls of the fort in order to weaken the foundations. Further, machines of war, possibly catapults, cast huge boulders at the walls while battering rams worked on the gates. However, the siege ended almost as early as it had begun. As early as it began? That doesn't make sense. However, the siege ended almost as quickly as it had begun. One of Timur's loyal commanders was of the same people that defended the city. This man asked Timur if this town could be spared, if he could convince the defenders to lay down their arms. And surprisingly, Timur agreed. And thankfully, the defenders agreed too. So Turchiz was taken, but its people were completely spared. Timur then crossed into the territory of Mazandaran, and for a second time, Amir Wali immediately sent word to Timur, apologizing for ever rebelling against him and announcing his submission to the Emir. Huge tributes and fine gifts were sent to Timur, and Timur accepted this apology and turned his army back around. Still, though, Amir Wali had not submitted in person. So, as you can probably guess, we will be returning with Timur to Mazandaran in future episodes. For now, though, Wali had submitted for a second time. Meanwhile, Timur received word that the siege back at Kalat with Ali Beg had gone somewhat well. It turns out that after a few days of sieging, some of Timur's best soldiers and most renowned officers decided to do the impossible. A handful of them would scale the mountainous cliffs with their weapons to surprise attack the defenders at night. And they did just that. Several dozen Timurids climbed the mountains, got inside the fortress, and surprised Ali Beg's soldiers. The two sides engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat in the middle of the night, and Yazdi tells us that both sides fought well. At one point, Ali Beg himself was forced to fight, and in this chaos, he called his men back and agreed to surrender. Both sides lowered their weapons, and Ali Beg even embraced the Timurid leader who had led the surprise attack. So Kalat was given to the Timurids. So, going back, did Kalat actually outlast Timur? Kinda. I mean, Timur wasn't there, so you could make that argument. But I could also then say that Canada was never conquered by Timur. I don't know. Anyway, I guess that Ali Beg probably could have fought off that surprise night attack if he had wanted to, but I think he realized that that would only postpone the inevitable. Thus, I think Kalat did fall to Timur, but I'm not going to take that away. I think it's still a neat story. Thus, Ali Beg traveled to Timur's camp as a respected prisoner. He came before Timur with his sword in one hand and a shawl in the other. This was an ancient tradition that signified that the person holding these items was swearing that he would fight until death, or until his face would need that shawl. And he was swearing this to Timur. Well, I don't know, why did I include that sentence? That's obvious. Anyway, Ali Beg then fell on his face and kissed the royal carpet that Timur stood on. Timur welcomed the man, praised him for his courage, rewarded him with treasures, and sent him to live in Samarkand. Ali Beg was now essentially a prisoner of Timur, but this was not to last. Now that the formalities of surrender were concluded, and once Ali Beg was in Samarkand, Timur ordered that the man be executed. And this was done. Ali Beg's head was cut off from his body. Thus, Timur's second invasion of Persia had been a success again. Amir Wali of Mazandaran had been subjugated, at least for now. Ali Beg had been dealt with, and the fortress of Kalat was controlled by Timurid soldiers. And Timur's loyal Sarbadar subjects, led by Ali Muayyad, had been saved. But there were several other affairs that must be attended to before we finish this episode. First of all, while Timur was doing his thing in Persia, let's not forget that his son Miran Shah was leading a force to put down the rebellion at Herat. So let's travel over there now to see what occurred. Miran Shah and his army had reached Herat, where the rebels had taken control. Since Timur had destroyed much of the walls in the year prior, Miran Shah's army was able to kind of storm right on in. Fierce medieval urban combat followed, with Timurids and Afghan rebels fighting from street to street. The defenders put up a valiant effort, but this was Miran Shah, son to none other than Amir Timur. Conquest was in his very blood. Eventually, the rebels were slaughtered, and Miran Shah sacked the city. Only a year ago, the people of Herat had forced their leader, Sultan Malik, to hand the city to Timur to avoid the destruction of their city. But now, they were given no such option. Miran Shah destroyed much of Herat, killed any defenders, and slaughtered thousands of civilians as well. And then he committed an act that we will see several more times in the future. an act that is one of the reasons why Timur's legacy is so infamous. Miran Shah had the captured rebels and civilians beheaded, and then the bodies of the defenders that had fallen were also beheaded. The Timurid soldiers, all carrying severed heads, began construction. Heads were arranged in rows, and then rows were placed on top of rows. Gigantic pyramids of severed human heads were erected around the smoldering ruins of Herat. These pyramids would be left standing. Animals and weather would strip flesh from bone only until pillars of skulls remained. Pillars sending the clearest of messages. Rebellion against Timur was utterly futile. Herat would be rebuilt. Rebuilding and repopulation programs began almost immediately. And like I said last episode, Herat would, in a few decades, be the most glorious city within Timur's empire. For now, though, it was nothing but a warning to Timur's enemies. When Timur heard that the rebellion had been crushed and his son was victorious, he sent word back to Samarkand. The former Sultan of Herat and of the Kart dynasty, Sultan Malik, was seized and executed. He may or may not have had a part to play in the rebellion, but Timur was done with him. Skipping a few years forward for a moment, the remaining members of the Kart dynasty were allowed to live in Samarkand until about 1386, but then during a banquet, either due to uncontrollable drunkenness or as part of a scheme, Miran Shah killed the rest of them, thus officially ending the Kart dynasty of Herat. The Kartids were no more. With the end of the Kartids, let's real quickly go over the Big Persian Five, as we've been calling them. And I realize I've been kind of switching up the order every time I list the Big Persian Five. I have to keep some confusion in your life, so in no particular order. Number 1. Like we just covered, the Kartid dynasty of Khorasan, with their capital at Herat, is gone. The dynasty is pretty much dead, or will be soon. The rebellion of Herat had been obliterated and now was firmly back in Timur's hands under the governance of his son Miran Shah. Number 2. The Jalayirids in Iraq and western Iran, with their capital of Baghdad. Timur has not interacted with them much, so we're just going to keep moving. Number 3, the Sarbadars of central Iraq, with their capital of Sebzevar and led by Ali Muayyad. They had pledged their loyalty to Timur during his first invasion of Persia, and had remained loyal to him through the second invasion. So far, they've been loyal subjects. As to what the future holds, though, only time will tell. Number 4, Mazandaran, along the Caspian coast, led by Amir Wali. He was Timur's enemy during the first invasion, but then he submitted, only to rebel again, and then to submit again. His ally, Ali Beg, ruling from his fortress of Kalat, is now gone. For the moment, Amir Wali is servant to Timur, but the fact that Wali has never personally submitted to Timur in person, that's redundant, but I'm making a point, it's a pretty big indicator that we're not done with his story yet. Spoiler alert, we're not done with his story yet. And finally, number 5 is the Muzaffarids, or the Muzaffarid dynasty in southern Persia along the coast of the Persian Gulf. And it is here, around the time of Timur's second invasion of Persia, or immediately after, that the Muzaffarids first join our story. In late 1382 and early 1383, messages were sent between Timur and the ruler of the Muzaffarid dynasty. This ruler was a man named Shah Shoja Muzaffari. Shah Shoja had been ruling the dynasty for quite some time. He took power in the year 1358 and had proven himself to be a respected and skillful leader. He was renowned for his wisdom and piety. He was a great patron of the arts and had a special love for poetry. Still, though, his reign was marked with regular struggle, both internally and externally. He fought his own brother for control of his kingdom before eventually making peace with him. He even had to execute his very own vizier at one point because of a plot to kill him. And then the borders of his kingdom were almost always under threat. He went to war several times with his western neighbors, another of the Big Persian Five, the Jaliyur dynasty. Thus, his rule was effective, but constantly struggling. But he was a leader of one of the Big Persian Five, and as such, communication between him and Timur took place around 1382. As to who reached out first and the content of the messages, we have two different accounts. And as is too often the case with this history, they're complete opposites. So let's hear what they both are. On one side, Yazdi says this. He claims that Shah Shoja reached out to Timur, extending his respect and his friendship. With this, expensive gifts were given as well. Timur, in response, returned the message of friendship and respect and sent some gifts to the Shah. Thus, while neither Shah Shoja or Timur had submitted to the other, they had opened up a nice friendship and mutual admiration. That's what Yazdi claims. And then on the complete other side of things, Arab Shah tells us this version. According to him, Timur started the communication between the two powers by demanding that Shah Shoja immediately bend the knee to him. No offer of friendship, no kind words or gifts, just an immediate command. And Arab Shah actually says he has the message and that it read as follows. God Almighty has appointed me lord over you and over all unjust princes and despotic kings, and has raised me above my enemies and aided me against my adversaries, as you have seen and heard. Therefore, if you obey and compose yourself to it, you will have done well. If not, know that three things go before me. Devastation, barrenness, and pestilence, all which evil will come back upon you and be given to you. Yeah, so a bit of a different tone, I'd say. So the big question is, which one is more accurate? Well, we don't know, and unfortunately we probably never will. I can see Timur offering friendship, as he has done this a few times to other rulers in the past, but we will also see later that Timur had a habit of sending nasty and insulting letters to other leaders he intended to attack. So that could be true too. Or perhaps what happened is that Timur offered friendship to Shah Shoja, but then sent the more incriminating letters to his son, who later took power. We just don't know. But regardless, communication was begun between the two powers. This was just a brief introduction for us to the Muzaffarids, but they will be back in our story soon. We have now reached late 1382. Timur's second invasion of Persia is complete, and he returns home to Samarkand. Upon reaching home, he deals with the final issue that had arisen, that being the Moghuls who were raiding his eastern territories. He sent an army to march into Mughal lands in order to defeat them and hopefully catch or kill Khan Kamaruddin, but Timur did not personally go. Thus, this Timurid army began Timur's, even though he wasn't with them, sixth, or fifth, or seventh, depending on how you count these things, invasion of Mogulistan. And nothing too drastic happened. The Mughal raiders were pushed out of Timur's territory, a few skirmishes took place here and there in which the Timurids claimed victory, but Khan Kamaruddin of the Moghuls escaped again. Still though, Timur's borders were back to being secure. But for every political and military victory Timur has, it seems like personal defeats were soon to follow. Because it is here that tragedy hit Timur's family again. The Princess Dilshadaga, who had been Timur's wife for about 8 years now, fell sick suddenly and died. Now, Timur does have plenty more wives and concubines. Most sources say that he had 43 regular wives and concubines, but nonetheless, this was still a devastating blow. But what was arguably even more painful is that only 4 days later, Timur's beloved sister, the Lady Turkan Aga, who had encouraged Timur out of his depression only a few months before, and who had cared for his realm in his absence and always been a source of strength for Timur, she also unexpectedly passed away. Both women were buried in beautiful mausoleums, and the entire city went into mourning. Ceremonies were held to honor the deceased, and alms and aid were given to the poor in their names. But as can be expected, Timur himself drew away from the world again, shrouding himself in nothing but utter depression. It took weeks for his friends, advisors, generals, and sons to finally win an audience with him. And when they finally got his ear, they told Timur that the best way to honor the dead, and further, the best way to honor God himself, was to carry out justice. And how did Timur aim to carry out justice? The drums of war began. The standards were lifted. There was injustice, rebellion left in Persia, and Timur was going to eradicate it. This has been the Timur Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. As a quick update, I will be releasing new episodes on every other Thursday from now on. I eventually would like to get that down to every Thursday, an episode a week. But unfortunately right now I'm working overtime to make ends meet, and until I'm able to cut that time back down, I don't think I'll have the time to prepare an episode every week. But every other week should be possible. So thank you all for your ongoing support and patience and encouragement. I read every message, and all communication means the world to me. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, why did I repeat? I don't know. It's late. I'm tired. If you want to reach out to me for any reason at all, you can email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter or Facebook at Timur Podcast. If you want to help support the show financially, you can donate on Patreon at patreon.com/timurpodcast. It's super easy to use, and you can sign up for any amount charged per month. All donations are extremely appreciated, and thank you all to have or are donating. You guys, seriously, you keep this going. Anyway, with that, it is time to end this episode. I will see you back on the steps soon, right here on the Timur Podcast.